I went to a private Catholic school from kindergarten to 3rd grade, and while I have fond memories of playing with my friends in the massive yard and climbing trees, I also have a memory of something that bothers me to this day. When I was in the 3rd grade, I started getting anonymous notes in my desk. I remember the first one was written on construction paper. It was wedged between my books. Looking back, it seems more like an adult attempting to mimic a child's handwriting. It said that I was pretty and they wanted to get to know me better. I asked my friends if they saw anyone at my desk before class started, and they all said no. They all had breakfast at school, and I always ate at home, so they were in the classroom much earlier than myself, so they would have noticed. The 4 of us sat together in a square. Over the next few weeks, I received a note about once a week. My best friend teased me saying I had a secret admirer, but the whole thing made me feel wrong. Sometimes, these notes were accompanied by oranges, my favorite fruit, or chocolate. Usually, I would find the note, always in my desk, and I would crumple it up when no one was looking and throw it away in a trash can. As the months went by, the notes became more sexual and suggestive. They were always written on construction paper. But about a month in, the note also had pictures of women in lingerie cut out and pasted onto them. The notes were always short and would say things like, "You're so sexy. I want to see you in your underwear. I bet you look better." And then progressed to my admirer professing his love and talking about touching me. I was obviously totally freaked out, but I had no idea what to do. I never responded. I just threw them away. My best friend stopped thinking it was funny and seemed just as scared as I was. Around this time, I started getting them every day. It was so unnerving. One day, I found one while reaching for my spelling book in the back of my desk, and it fell to the floor, right in front of my teacher. She bent to pick it up, and whatever she read made her eyes go wide. She looked at the note, at me, at the note again, and took a deep breath and told me to see her at recess. At recess, she asked me a lot of questions like when did I start getting them, and if I knew who they were from. I told her everything I knew, which honestly wasn't much. She assured me I wasn't in trouble. She went through my desk and found 3 more notes. I guess I'd missed a few, and every time she read one, her eyes got wide and her face got red. She ended up calling my parents in for a meeting. I still don't know what they talked about, but those notes finally stopped. Or my teacher was intercepting them. I don't really know. So, creepy-ass dude who sent graphic, vulgar notes to an 8-year-old, let's not meet.
Number 2.
My parents split up when I was 4 years old. My dad had a history of substance abuse, thievery, and cheating, and in a small town of western Tennessee, he had no chance of keeping it a secret for long. My dad ended up with a lady named Ellen, who had a degenerative disease that eventually took her mobility. Ellen's mother was in one of the 2 nursing homes in town, and being as I spent every weekend with my dad, I spent a lot of time there. I'd been around sick or elderly people for my entire life at that point, so I'd grown accustomed to helping anyone that was less fortunate than myself. I would help out there with anything I could, feeding residents who couldn't grip silverware, wheeling them back to their rooms, etc. I really enjoyed it there for a while, and I think that was partly due to my siblings being 9 and 10 years older than me. By the time my parents had me, their marriage was in shambles. My dad was out partying all the time, and my mother was just tired. She did the best she could, but she ended up a single mother working a full-time psychology job and just didn't have enough time to do everything she needed to do. So, needless to say that I enjoyed the attention and praise of the residents at the nursing home. Well, most of them, at least. The first time I ever felt uneasy there was when I'd been going for maybe a few months. On this particular day, my dad and I were huddled around a dining room table with Ellen and her mother. They frequently discussed things that were boring or beyond my 5-year-old comprehension, such as her mother's will and estate, so I was blankly watching the rain pepper one of the floor-to-ceiling windows. When Ellen's mother had her fill of dinner, I quickly jumped up to take her tray to the dish area. She thanked me with a grin and said, "We need more youngsters like you," as she said frequently. As I was about halfway through the cafeteria, I was startled by a very raspy voice. "I'm done too." I jumped. I dropped a fork off the dinner tray. I turned on the spot to find the source of the voice, and that was the first time I'd ever seen Chester. Chester was an elderly Caucasian man. His hair was short, gray, and usually unkempt. I remember thinking about how small he seemed, short and unhealthily skinny. His pale skin seemed to barely stretch over his skull, and I just remember being generally unsettled by this man. I wasn't sure what to do, so I picked up the dropped fork, gave the dinner tray to a cafeteria worker, and sped back to my dad. I refused to look at Chester again as I walked past, but I heard a deep chuckle, and his eyes followed me as far as they could. I stayed glued to my dad for the rest of the visit. I was thoroughly creeped out, but I was at least there once a week. I continued to help out other residents whenever possible. I quickly became a big favorite with staff and residents alike. Nurses would ask me to do small things for them, and I'd happily oblige. I actively avoided Chester during my visits. He hadn't tried to speak to me since the day I'd first seen him, but he'd always watch me if I was in the common area. His eyes burned with a hunger that I didn't understand at that age. Now that I'm an adult female, though I think I could take an educated guess at what he was thinking. One night, the nursing home had a dance for the residents. They played old music that some people danced to with their children or grandchildren that attended the event. I particularly remembered a lively elderly man named John having a wonderful time dancing in his wheelchair. I was enjoying watching the residents in such high spirits and even got to dance with my dad for a while. When he got tired of me standing on his feet, he placed me back on the ground and spun me around a few times before calling it quits. When he began to spin me is when I noticed Chester's eyes glued to me just a few feet away. I hadn't noticed him before that moment, but he had a menacing look on his face. It was as if the anger in his eyes was burning holes through my skin. I tried to get my dad's attention, but he only mumbled something about stepping out for a smoke and walked away. I should have just ran after my dad, but I didn't. I was so afraid of Chester that I was rooted to the spot. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring back at him. I don't think I even blinked until he finally said, laughing, "What's the matter with you, girl? You look like you've seen a ghost." I gulped. My 5-year-old brain had no idea what to say or do. I kept telling myself to run outside to my dad, but I was terrified of the dark, and I didn't know where exactly he was at that point. "Well, aren't you gonna help an old man back to his room?" Chester growled. Everything in me screamed that was the last thing I needed to do. As I stood there deliberating, a nurse had told Chester that his medicine was on his bedside table, and that he could go back to his room whenever he was ready. She then hurried off to the opposite side of the room to wheel another resident back to their bed. Chester looked at me as though his prayers had been answered. "I see you helping out with a lot of patience here, kid. All I'm asking is to be wheeled back to my bed." At this point, my 5-year-old brain had determined that quickly taking Chester back to his room was the lesser of two evils compared to venturing out into the darkness for my dad. I wanted to get it over with, so I walked quickly over to Chester's wheelchair. I heard him moan softly as I leaned down to unlock his wheel brakes. The walk to his room was short. When we arrived, I barely pushed him inside the room and turned to walk toward the window to find my dad. Chester quickly stopped me. "I need to be closer to my bed, girl. My medicine and water are over there, and I have to take it now." I was terrified to actually go into his room with him, but I had also seen him walking around from time to time, and I was afraid that he would just stand up and grab me. I pushed him a bit further towards his bed and nightstand. "Closer," he barked repeatedly until I was so nervous that I almost pushed him right into the nightstand. He growled, almost inaudibly, and then sprung up from his wheelchair quickly. When he stood, he turned around to face me. My horrified eyes looked down to see that he had an erection, although I wasn't sure what that was at that age. He began walking towards me with an unbelievably creepy smile on his face. "How about a little kiss as a thank you? Or would you like to tuck me in?" At this point, I bolted. I ran outside and right into my dad, who I now know had been smoking marijuana in his car. I jumped into his arms crying, and I told him that I wanted to leave right away. I had told him about being creeped out by Chester before, but he repeatedly dismissed it and said that my imagination was just running wild. This time, though, he calmed me down enough for me to tell him what happened. He had a very sheepish expression at the end of it, and sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. My own dad then began to tell me and said that I should have known better than to enter a male resident's room alone, even though he'd let me do it loads of times before this happened. I honestly think that he was just afraid of my mom finding out what had happened while he was outside getting high. I also found out later that my father was sexually abused as a child and could never talk about it, which also helps explain a lot of his shameful reaction. I did tell my mother about the situation, who was upset on so many different levels. She kept telling me that she took care of it afterwards, but I still don't know what exactly happened to Chester. My mom also severely limited my father's alone time with me, which eventually changed to visits that were personally supervised by her after a few other ordeals that occurred involving him.